Hi, I'm Rhiannon, owner of the Epsom Bakehouse, and thanks for joining me live today. We're going to talk about if you've ever baked a loaf of bread and the end result turned out a bit dense, underbaked, perhaps there were really large holes, and then the rest of the bread was kind of very dense texture. We'll talk about a tech you can do next time you bake bread at home. And if you'd like more bread making tips, recipes and information about my live online bread making classes, new dates for which are just up now for autumn onwards, then you can sign up to my newsletter via the link below this video. So today I wanted to talk to you about how if you've baked a loaf of bread at home and it's turned out really dense and get that really close texture, perhaps the dough hasn't baked all the way through, you've got really uneven, perhaps holes in the bread, sometimes really big holes, and then the rest of the bread is really dense. And you think, goodness, what a waste of time it was me making that bread. Well, it definitely wasn't. And this is a check that you can do next time you bake bread to make sure that your dough has risen enough. And making sure that your bread dough rises before you bake it is really key to getting that light, fluffy texture that you'd like in your bread. The gas is going to fill out, the gas the yeast are producing is going to fill out your dough and create all those tiny little pockets of air that then turn into that light, fluffy crumb, rather than it being really dense and packed together because there's not been time for that dough to rise. And you might have seen in recipes that dough, it says things like wait for your dough to double in size, or just leave the dough for an hour and then it's time to bake. And all of those can be a bit dependent on various factors. So instead, use your sight and touch to check if your dough has risen. So I've got two examples of dough here, and this one is one that hasn't risen at all. It's kneaded, and it's still a fairly solid ball of dough. So if your dough hasn't risen, obviously you can start to look to see if it's filled out the bowl. So I would want to come back and see this dough rising up in the bowl, perhaps filling out the sides of the bowl as well as the middle. But also, if I poke my finger into the ball of dough, I hope you can see there that it's not really making much of a dent. It's a fairly solid ball of dough. I can barely make a hole in it. So if you press your finger into your dough, not too hard, especially if you've shaped it and you're about to bake it, you don't want to deflate your dough. But if you press your finger into your dough and it springs back really quickly, then your dough is not risen enough. It's still really solid, your finger just spring off it, your dough isn't risen, there's no gas in it. And if you tried to bake that, you would make that really dense loaf of bread that would not be particularly easy to eat. You probably wouldn't want to eat it. It would be dense, it probably wouldn't bake through. Then I've shaped some dough into this loaf tin, and it's just about coming over the top of the loaf tin. I would probably just want to have this a little bit higher on the loaf tin before I bake it. But if I very, very gently in this corner push my finger into the dough, hopefully you can see there that I've made quite a dent. Now that was a really gentle because I don't want to deflate this dough. I don't want it to collapse down. But just by making a dent, the dent doesn't spring back. And it just stays slightly in the dough. So you know now that there is plenty of gas within that dough. It's got that beautiful curved top, and that little finger poke test is that the dough doesn't spring back. It springs back a little, but the dent stays. And that's a really great test to show that your dough has risen. The other thing you can do, which you probably won't be able to see here, is that your dough will be a little bit jelly-like, a little bit wobbly. So your dough is risen, and it is risen up in the tin, and you can just do that little test to check that your dough has risen enough. So not just knowing that it's doubled in size, not just knowing that you've left it for the amount of time in the recipe, but actually that you can do that little test and your dough isn't this solid ball of dough that you can barely poke your finger into. It's a solid ball of dough still. Just do that little check and make sure that your dough is risen enough before you bake it. And then you will get that light, airy crumb rather than that densely packed doughy bread that you probably think this is not going to be eaten. So let me know if that's helpful and you are doing your check on your bread, on your dough before you bake it and baking some delicious bread at home. And if you've got any other bread making questions you'd like answered in a live, then do let me know. You can send me a message or put a comment below this video. And if you'd like more bread making tips, recipes and information on my live online classes, where you can learn to bake everything from baguettes to ciabatta to cinnamon buns, sourdough bread and much more, then do sign up for my newsletter via the link below. And I'll be back again soon to talk more bread making questions answered. So see you then.